Havana, Cuba's English language broadcast, and not only radio, but also television. We're on the air today with Televisión Internacional, Prensa Latina, and Radio Havana, Cuba in English, as we do every day at 3, the hour here in Havana, Eastern Time, for 2 hours today, our English language broadcast, simultaneous broadcast, simulcast with television and on the internet too. We're on Facebook, on Televisión Internacional, on their Facebook page, in video and audio. And with me is someone who has much more experience in television than I do. I hide behind a microphone in radio, and I'm more comfortable actually there. She's comfortable both in radio and television. Cristina Escobar, nice to have you here with us.
It's such a pleasure to be with you, Ed. I think this is such a great opportunity. Thank you so much. We are on TV, we are on social networks, and we are on your radios as well. It's such a privilege. There's a reason why we're here today, and it's quite an important one because it's a date that should push us to a reflection on how the Cuba-US relations has determined the fate of this country. 60 years ago, John F. Kennedy signed a proclamation 3447 that made the blockade or embargo official, which meant for this country putting in paper the intention of not allowing the Cuban Revolution to thrive. 60 years later, this February 3rd, we're having this joint broadcast to tell you different stories with different voices of what this policy has meant for the Cuban people.
That's right. 60 years ago today, U.S. President John F. Kennedy signed the presidential executive order making the blockade, the embargo, official, but it was something that actually began much before that, at the time of the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, on January the 1st, 1959. That was actually when the sanctions and the attempts to overthrow the Cuban Revolution began. Today, now 60 years ago, marks the actual official U.S. blockade or embargo against Cuba.
It's not a reason for celebration, it's a tragic date, but as a matter of fact, we will go through different angles of how to understand this conflict. We invite you to tune in, to stay around, to catch up on YouTube or Facebook or on your televisions. We are also on Cuban National Television through Canal Caribe with the translation of our colleagues over there. So we're everywhere in Spanish and English. Just join in for this story of what 60 years of resistance look like. We're going to make a pause and we'll be back right away.
That is the country they are blocking, the country they are trying to surrender by hunger and disease.
Bloqueo es una guerra contra Cuba. Es la guerra
It is a universal war
con ese inmenso poderío a su
with
favor,
that immense power on its side and against our country's economy.
de nuestro país.
So the news today is the fact that the Foreign Ministry has issued a declaration by the revolutionary government. Is online, you can look it up. It's quite important, Ed, because is the document official of the Cuban government of what this important date means for the Cuban people. The revolutionary government condemns the continuance for over 60 years of the economic, commercial, and financial sanctions formally imposed by the U.S. on February 3rd, 1962. Afterwards, they say that the pretexts have varied with the passage of time, while the intentions have remained unchanged. Afterwards, they quote quite an interesting document, I believe, Ed, which was the Mallory, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the State Department, from 1960. It looks like it was written just yesterday, saying, provoking disappointment and discouragement through economic dissatisfaction and hardships weaken the economic life, denying Cuba funds and supplies to reduce nominal and real salaries with the objective of provoking hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government. This is the declaration of the revolutionary government, quoting this document that in a way shows what has been the policy towards Cuba for 60 years of just not allowing the Cuban Revolution to thrive. The document also points out the losses accumulated during these 6 decades for the Cuban economy, and of course this is as a developing country. And of course in this year specifically, quite important to mention the fact that in the context of the efforts addressing the COVID-19 pandemic, the intensification of the blockade or embargo assumes an unheard of level of cruelty, in impeding donations in a spirit of solidarity, attempting to hinder the development of Cuba's vaccines and to disrupt access to basic medicines and supply. Definitely a tragedy, and this declaration, which we encourage you to read, to look up, it's in English and in Spanish. It's quite important to understand what this date means for this country. The last paragraph, I think, is also quite enlightening. It says, the revolutionary government calls once again strenuously and emphatically for an end to the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the United States. Our condemnation will remain firm and invariable until the complete cessation of this inhuman and illegal policy. So I do think that this proclamation is, this 3447 proclamation, it's a reason to go over why this policy of blockade or embargo it's so damaging for the Cuban people. And we do have quite an amazing panel with us today. I was telling you before going on the air that I don't think, I've been covering Cuba-US relations for many years, so have you. I don't think we've been able to gather this amount of people in one place, so I feel quite privileged to have these many voices to tell you the story of how the blockade is lived in this country 60 years later, right?
That's right. And as you mentioned, the declaration of the Revolutionary Government of Cuba is available in Spanish, in Espanol, in Inglés as well, in English, on the web. You can check us out there on many of the web pages and the social networks where you can read that. It's about a 3-page document that we just summarized here. Very good. Very
right, and probably if you're reading this document and you don't really know what Cuba means by losses, by Habsburgdom, by how this embargo hinders the exports of Cuba, of tackling COVID-19 effects, how does this work? Why is this such a big deal? Why is always newsworthy for the Cuban people, not only in Cuba, because the victims of the embargo are not only living in Cuba. Any Cuban citizen in the world are in a way victims of that, and we will be talking about this afterwards. When you see a lot of efforts, we were able to see a lot of efforts from abroad to bring in donations, and it was very interesting to see that everyone that wanted to bring in donations, and they were posting on social media. Please contribute this way or other. But if you do use PayPal or any other platform, please do not mention the word Cuba.
That's right.
Because if you do, then the possibility of having the process interrupted is quite big. By the way, we didn't say, for those who are watching us on TV, for the sake of communication, we are not using masks. And just for you to know, although everyone in the room are using masks, in the moment in which we talk to people here on the stage, and then when we listen to the students, they will, in the moment of speaking, won't be using masks. But as you know, or if you don't, we're telling you masks is absolutely mandatory in this country. And we're just doing this for the sake of communication. But let's go to our first panelist.
Yeah, let's get started with that.
Abelardo Moreno, thank you so much for being here, Ambassador. You're quite well known in Cuba, but I
hope so.
Yes, you are. But I need to tell our audience abroad, why are you such an interesting source for this issue? Abelardo Moreno has served in many countries in the world. He played an outstanding role in the creation of genuinely Latin American organizations and has special memories of representing Cuba in international negotiations, from the non-alive movement to many other stories that I know you do have. I'm dying to read your book that you just recently presented, I believe right here, International Negotiation Art and Science of the Negotiation Process. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much. I believe one of the students have a question for Abelardo. Thank you. What's your name? Hi.
Good afternoon. My name is Carla Oliveros. I'm a second-year student here at the Institute.
Thank you so much for being here. What's your question for Abelardo?
Well, as Cristina said at the beginning of the program, the U.S. blockade against Cuba came into force in 1962 with President Kennedy's Presidential Proclamation 3447, and it has been enforced with subsequent legislative instruments. So my question is, what are the historical conditions that prior to 1962 that led the United States to such a point of confrontation with Cuba?
You have the floor.
Thank you. Well, in my view, your question is mainly geared at determining what were the conditions in relations between the United States and Cuba that led to the proclamation 3447 by President John F. Kennedy. I think that really these conditions are well known. First of all, the overthrow of Fulgencio Batista, a staunch ally of the United States government, the example that emanated from a liberating revolution, the success of a liberating revolution in the very backyard of the United States, the popular nature of the Cuban Revolution that ensured that all benefits were for all people. That means that everybody could have an equality of opportunities. And last but not least, the increase, the strengthening of relations with the Soviet Union and the socialist countries, which really, that was anathema in an era marked by fierce anti-communism and McCarthyism. Of course, we have also to take into account that U.S. companies in Cuba had been affected precisely by the fact that they had been nationalized in benefit of the whole of the population. Therefore, the governments then in power in the United States, headed by General Dwight Eisenhower first and by John F. Kennedy later, had as a primary objective, as it has continued to be throughout all these years up to the present, the destruction of the Cuban Revolution. I have no quarrel with the assertion that President Kennedy's Proclamation 3447 of February the 3rd, 1962, marked the official establishment of the blockade by the government of the United States. But in reality, it began much earlier. Not at that moment, it began much earlier. Suffice it to recall the infamous memorandum prepared in April 1960 by Lester Mallory, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, regarding the overthrow of the Cuban Revolutionary Government, that even if well known, if very well known, is illustrative of the above. Mallory's document, approved by the then Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American States, Roy Rubottom, says, and I quote, "Every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba If such a policy is adopted, it should be the result of a positive decision which would call forth a line of action which, while as adroit as inconspicuous as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government. End of quote. A case in point is the fact that President Dwight D. Eisenhower imposed the first economic coercion measures against our country in October 1950. And I underline October 1950. 15 months prior, that in practice represented more or less 90% of Cuban sugar exports, and subsequently banning all U.S. export to Cuba except food and medicines. Obviously, these measures were not isolated. They were part and parcel of a broader strategy aimed at overthrowing the Cuban government, including the support and organization of terrorist acts in order to destabilize the Cuban society and the preparation of an invasion. Another case in point is that in October 1960, once again, October 1960, the Department of Commerce decreed that any transfer, sale, or lease of ships owned by the United States citizens to the government or to the Cuban citizens was illegal. Subsequently, the scope of this measure was expanded to prevent the leasing of ships with cargo between the United States and Cuba in order to obstruct free trade between our country and the rest of the world. Taking into account time constraints, I think that these examples, the examples above, are sufficient to argue with merit that even if Kennedy's proclamation 3447 was the official inauguration of the blockade against Cuba, in practical terms, it had started much before. In addition, we have to incorporate in any analysis the context of relations between both countries characterized, as I said at the outset, by an increase in the aggressive U.S. stance against Cuba. This reality that led to the break of diplomatic relations with Havana by the U.S. authorities very early in 1961, the 3rd of January precisely, comprised permanent attacks against Cuban interests, both in Cuba and abroad, with a promotion and support by the government of the United States of a large number of terrorist organizations operating from U.S. territory, with U.S. financing, with U.S. logistical support, and even with U.S. direct participation, the creation and supply of armed bands in Cuban mountains, and finally, the Bay of Pigs invasion, 9 months before President Kennedy's proclamation 3447. This meant the existence of an undeclared war against Cuba, which was permanently repeated, but by no avail at the United Nations Security Council. Even the piece of legislation that was used to that effect, the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, already used the ominous word enemy, with the consequence derived thereof. Since July 1960, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, Raúl Roa García, had denounced the prevailing situation in the Security Council. He declared at the time, and I repeat, July 1960. He declared at the time, and I quote, "The growing succession of slanders, falsifications, and attacks to which our revolution has been subjected in the United States, culminating in the reduction of the which constitutes the international crime of economic aggression, began as soon as the new era of Cuban liberation started. The accusations were the same then as they are now, such as the punitive measures that were already proposed and that included everything from the elimination of the set quota, economic aggression, to the landing of the Marines, military aggression. Cuba has been subjected to a policy of intimidation, coercion, and threats, among which one of the most important is the elimination of the sugar quota." End of quote. This was denounced by the Cuban government in the words of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba early in 1960. Well, I hope that with these brief thoughts, I have responded to your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Largo Moreno, a veteran diplomat and still very active over many years here in Cuba in the diplomatic arena. You've tuned to Radio Havana, Cuba, Cubavisión Internacional, on television and on radio, and we want to reiterate what Cristina said earlier, the effects of this economic embargo and blockade on Cubans here and Cubans abroad as well and everywhere in the world. We have coming up next some comments by Cubans who are having their own businesses here in Cuba. They're in the private sector, non-state sector, who talk to us and tell us about some of the problems that they encounter because of the economic sanctions imposed by the United States against Cuba.
San Cristobal's exclusive clientele, including renowned artists and global figures, among them almost 20 heads of state, have earned the restaurant located in central Havana a certain level of prestige. Carlos Cristobal Marquez, the owner of the establishment, explains that despite being a stone's throw away from hotels, which make it popular among tourists, San Cristobal, like many other private businesses, has also been impacted by the U.S. blockade. Above all, according to the owner, due to travel restrictions which had limited the flow of U.S. visitors to the island.
We did see an improvement after Obama slightly opened things up towards Cuba, although not completely, especially, like you said, with regard to cruise ships and groups of United States tourists. We definitely saw an improvement. We would receive 2 large groups a day, one in the morning and one in the evening, as well as all the other tourists who would visit the restaurant. We saw a real boom during that period.
Even U.S. President Barack Obama visited San Cristobal during his official visit to Havana in 2016. In the final years of his administration, relations between Cuba and the U.S. improved substantially. 23 new agreements across various areas were signed between Havana and Washington, and Cuba was removed from the state sponsors of terrorism list. With the arrival of Donald Trump to the White House in early 2017, this process of rapprochement suffered a drastic setback, according to the director of the Center for Hemispheric and United States Studies, Raúl Rodriguez.
We returned to a scenario of hostile aggression towards the adversary. And although the U.S. didn't retract the accords, it didn't actively pursue them either. In 2018, the so-called health incidents affecting U.S. diplomatic personnel occurred. These incidents were used as a pretext to expel 15 Cuban staffers from the embassy in Washington and reduce personnel at the U.S. diplomatic headquarters in Havana, leaving it practically inoperable.
Trump took unprecedented measures against Cuba, including the activation of Title III of the Helms-Burton Act, not to mention the 243 new sanctions as part of the genocidal blockade policy intended to suffocate the island's economy, stifle remittances, impact migration policy, the banking sector, and Cuba's access to fuel in order to cut off key sources of revenue for the island and hamper its trade.
An important step taken by the Trump administration was the use of blacklisting, like the specially designated nationals and blocked persons list, which was important in targeting insurance companies handling fuel shipments to Cuba.
Just days before leaving office, Donald Trump reinserted Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism, a line followed by Democrat and current U.S. President Joe Biden in his first year in office, despite campaign promises to pursue a policy of rapprochement between Havana and Washington. U.S. hostility and aggression towards the island have continued even during the pandemic.
It is basically the continuation of the same policy adopted by Trump. We could even say that it's gone further by sanctioning Cuban officials, which in reality has no economic impact, as these measures are already included in the broad system of sanctions, or unilateral coercive measures imposed by the U.S. on Cuba, but they do have a political significance.
In the face of the tightening of the criminal U.S. blockade, solidarity with the island and demands for a change in U.S.-Cuba policy have increased, like the letter signed by 114 members of Congress, urging Biden to normalize relations with the island. A growing number of voices in and outside of the U.S. are calling for bridges of love and respect and an end to economic persecution and the separation of families.
Well, welcome back. We are in this joint broadcast with Coalición Internacional, Prensa Latina, Radio Havana, Cuba, and we are also on Canal Caribe on Cuban National Television. Thank you so much for joining us. Also on YouTube and on Facebook. We didn't say at the beginning, Ed, that thank our hosts here. Higher Institute of International Relations. In the theater of this institute, we are here with the students of International Relations. Thank you so much for having us and all the fuss that it means having a TV broadcast and a radio broadcast in this theater. I told you we were going to have different voices to explain us why this is such a complicated matter and why it is so important to communicate well what the sanctions mean for this country. We thank very much the presence here of Carlos Fernandez de Cosillo. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being here. I'll tell you a little bit about Cosillo. He's the Deputy Minister of the U.S. Division of the Cuban Foreign Ministry. He's an expert. He's served in South Africa, in Canada, in the U.S., and he's represented Cuba in many international scenarios. Again, thank you so much. Your experience is very valuable for us here. I have a bunch of questions for you, but I'm going to let the students, because I know that the students are very eager of having, like, can you imagine studying to be a diplomat and having all these, like the superheroes of Cuban diplomacy here. We have students that have, a student has a question. What's your name? Hello, thank you for being here.
My name is Beatriz, and I would like to ask Vice Minister Fernandez de Cosillo a question.
Sure, please.
To what extent and with what justifications can the U.S. government publicly express that it is supposedly concerned about the human rights of the Cuban people and at the same time maintain a genocidal blockade?
Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Perhaps the best example to illustrate the real motivation of the U.S. with the economic blockade is shown by the manner in which the U.S. has conducted itself during the COVID pandemic. At a moment when the international community has been calling for compassion, for solidarity, for countries and governments to put aside differences and cooperate, the U.S. government chose to take advantage of the pandemic and reinforce, or to strengthen the coercive measures that are entailed in the economic blockade. In other words, it chose to make life more difficult for Cuba, make life more difficult for common Cubans in the street, and to hamper or to put obstacles to the effort of the government to cope with the pandemic, to save lives, to protect people from getting contact, to getting infected, and to make it difficult for us to acquire the materials, the equipment, the medicines, and the inputs that we needed for our own pharmaceutical industry and for our health system. That shows you which is the real motivation behind the U.S. government when they speak about the economic blockade. So for an official in the U.S. government or for offices in the government to claim that what they have in mind is the welfare of the Cuban people and that their motivation is the protection of the human rights of Cubans would entail a significant quota of cynicism and of dishonesty. The economic blockade damages people's lives in real terms. Because of its impact, because of its length, it is a massive, a flagrant, and a systematic violation of the human rights of all the people of a whole nation for over 60 years. It is a crime what the U.S. has been doing. So again, it is at least cynical and dishonest to claim that the motivation of the U.S. government, what moves them, is the welfare of the people of Cuba or the idea of protecting the human rights of the Cuban people.
We've been in this since we began. We're trying to use both words, embargo and blockade, because here in Cuba it is known as a bloqueo. A lot of times our diplomats abroad say blockade, but for the English-speaking peoples, it's probably easier to understand embargo. What's the difference between the two terms? What are semantics here are quite important. What's your intake in this regard?
I would say that the difference is not purely semantic or of form. It's of content. It's in the essence of the words. U.S. politicians, the ones that mostly promote the economic blockade, say that it's simply an embargo. And one normally understands an embargo when a country chooses to prohibit exports to another country or to prohibit imports from that country, as the U.S. does to Cuba. But the policy of the United States towards Cuba, in this sense, is much broader. It goes much further than this. The U.S. does not only prohibit the import of Cuban products. The U.S. prohibits the import of any product produced in any country if it has a minimum of components of Cuba. And by component, they mean, by law, they mean spare parts, raw materials, commodities, software, intellectual property, copyrights, everything. Meaning, for example, that the United States cannot import by law a candy bar produced in any country around the world if it has 1 grain of Cuban sugar. Or it cannot import steel, and the U.S. is a major importer of steel, if there's an ounce of Cuban nickel or Cuban cobalt in that steel. Or it cannot import vehicles, cars or trucks or machinery, if it has steel that has components of Cuban nickel, Cuban mineral, Cuban ore of subtype.
It's a lie that is bilateral.
And it goes on and on. But in addition to that, the U.S. prohibits exports to Cuba. That's why they say any country chooses with whom to trade. But the U.S. also prohibits any export from any country of any product produced in that country if it has 10% or more of U.S. input. Again, meaning spare parts, raw materials, commodities, intellectual property, technology, and any type. Meaning that Cuba cannot import a tractor produced in a European, an African, and Asian country if it has 10% of components that are originated in the United States. And for example, Cuba has huge difficulties for acquiring aircraft, civilian aircraft, because the whole, in the globalized economy like the one we have today, the security systems of all civilian aircraft in the world have more than 10% U.S. components. That means that it is extremely difficult for Cuba to acquire, or almost impossible, to acquire aircraft for a civilian fleet for public air traffic. But it doesn't stop there. The U.S., by law, instructs its government to go after Cuba's commercial and financial transactions in any country in the world, and to put pressure on the commercial entities, private or state-owned, and financial institutions, private or state-owned, that do business with Cuba. Threaten them, alert them that they could run into trouble if they ever in the future are going to do business with Cuba. Every year, several times a year, one sees in the news the information about companies that have to pay fines, that have to pay penalties, that are penalized by the Cuba 15 years ago, 10 years ago. That happens every day. So in a globalized world, how many companies can one find that is ready to run the risk of being penalized in the United States because of doing business with Cuba? That limits, in a very significant way, the capacity of Cuba to do business around the world. But again, it doesn't stop there. Cuba does not import fuel, oil, from the United States. It has not for 60 years, since the proclamation, or even before that. Yet, the United States has been going after exports of oil, shipping companies that transport oil, port authorities where shipments of oil are cargoed, to deprive Cuba from the availability of the fuel that we need for our economy, for our services, for our hospitals, for our industry, for lighting, for electricity, for everything. So if that is not a blockade, the attempt to fence Cuba as an island and not allow our economy to function, then what is a blockade? They are trying to block Cuba from the outside world. One can go into what happens with internet, the hundreds of sites that Cuba has no access to them, implying culture, technology, education. The amount of technology that we need for healthcare, for agricultural research, any area of the science to which simply we have no access because the U.S. prohibits it, regardless of where we go to look for that technology. And I could go on for hours speaking about this, but the fact of the matter is that to say that it is a simple embargo is to misrepresent the nature of the policy of economic warfare of the U.S. against Cuba.
So it's not about Cuba-U.S. relations, something that they do say a lot. And we don't have much time, but I final question on this. The narrative around the U.S. Discourse on Cuba is that this is a failed state, and that the problems, the domestic problems that are there in Cuba is because the socio-political system, it doesn't work, and it's because of the government, it's because of the political situation. They never mention the scope of the sanctions for this country, for this economy, and so the narrative is to blame the government for something that they impose. How to understand this in a context in which they stand up and say that they're doing all of this for the welfare of the Cuban people?
Well, a few minutes ago, Ambassador Abelardo Moreno quoted a piece of a already famous memorandum of the State Department of 1960 by who was then Undersecretary of State Mallory, in which he describes that the aim of the U.S. policy is to make Cuba a failed state, precisely to make Cuba a failed state.
Since 1960.
Since It started even before. He
Right.
described it then. It began.
It could be reading it just yesterday.
It's
You read it. It's so
to make Cuba a failed state, because it is important for the U.S. to make sure that in the minds of everybody around the world, that any country that takes the risk or dares to challenge U.S. control has to be a failed state. Any country that takes ownership of its natural wealth instead of big transnational capital has to be a failed state. That any country that refuses to accept the imposition from another government has to be a failed state. And that is the history of U.S. policy towards Cuba. But it could be tested. If the U.S. is so sure that Cuba is a failed state, they could have a blockade holiday of 2 years or 3 years and see which is the impact of it. But also we have things that we can look at. Anybody who, from the U.S., from around the world, who visited Cuba between 2013 and 2017 would have witnessed that there was no doubt that there was a growth in the Cuban economy, that there was an improvement in our economy, that there was an improvement in the standard of living of the Cuban population and the livelihood of the country. And that beginning with the measures that the government of Trump started to apply in 2018, and above all 2019, that trend changed. And that was with just the very, very few exceptions that the government, the Democratic government of Barack Obama, introduced to the legislations of blockade. Again, there were, and just with that, there was an improvement in the Cuban economy, which shows you that once these were erased or new restrictions were put in place, there was an impact, direct and evident impact in the performance of the Cuban economy and in life in the country as a whole.
Thank you so much,
Welcome.
Deputy Minister, for being here, for your words. We are in this joint broadcast. We have more information on it, right?
Yes, we do. We want to go to some students, U.S. medical students who study medicine here in Cuba. Over 200 U.S. students are studying at the Latin American School of Medicine in Havana. And we prepared a couple of statements from some of the students who are studying here in Havana.
Hi, my name is Katie Kirby. I am a second-year medical student at the Latin American School of Medicine. I'm from the state of Missouri, the city of Springfield, and I've been studying here in Cuba for 3 years. As a person who gets the privilege of living in Cuba and seeing its impact, I have felt firsthand how there's a lack of resources, including medication, food, and petroleum, or gas as we call it in the States. Because of the blockade, there's a lack of access to simple resources simply because they can't receive items or trade with people because of the blockade. The blockade is an infringement on human rights because it prevents simple everyday necessities from being met to their best, to their maximum capacity, as we would hope. And that is why today I demand that President Biden take a stance and eliminate the blockade against Cuba, to make a change and not just speak with his words that he's going to bring something, but he takes actions to make that happen. Thank you.
My name is Jessie Bass. I am from Chicago, Illinois, and I'm a second-year medical student at the Latin American School of Medicine. Cuba has been generous enough to offer U.S. students a free scholarship to come and study medicine in Cuba. And while their approach has always been a biopsychosocial model, I have seen what the embargo has done to the Cuban people, even in terms of the medicine that is occurring right now. And so what I demand is that President Joe Biden end this blockade, because not only as future doctors, but also as human beings, our job is to look and find the humanity within the human individual.
President Biden, end the embargo now.
And you're watching us, listening to us on Radio Havana, Cuba, Cuba Visión Internacional, on the social networks, We're all over the place. Here today with Stop the Blockade. It is a blockade.
It is, according to Deputy Minister Garcia.
Stop the embargo, and it's a virus too.
Well, we'll be talking about people that are dedicating their lives to stop COVID-19 pandemic and trying to find solutions for a country like this, like ours, which is so damaged and so limited because of the sanctions. It's such a pleasure to have with us in the stage two women, and I'm particularly happy about that. There are two bright scientists. Dr. Tania Grombet is the Clinical Research Director of the Center of Molecular Immunology. She's a medical doctor and member of the Cuban Academy of Science. She specializes in cancer immunotherapy. That might be like quite a complicated word, but basically now it's quite an important knowledge because she's been able to invent and produce with other scientists drugs that have been proved useful for treating COVID-19, the disease. And also with us, a woman that has been on TV, gladly, a lad, recently. She's Dagmar Garcia. Dr. Dagmar Garcia, she works at the Finlay Institute of Vaccines. She's the research director, an expert on vaccines, and she has a PhD in pharmaceutical sciences. Both of them have February work schedules, so we're very, very happy to have them both here. I know they are always like in a rush. They have a lot to do. Let's start with you, Dr. Grombet. I mean, I could talk to you for hours. We've done it. I've interviewed you, and I've enjoyed a lot these interviews with Telesur English. These sanctions, how determine your work? Like, what do you have and what you don't have? And what are the kind of pressures that create for what you do?
So thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great privilege to be here representing the Cuban science. Initially, we thought that Dagmar would be starting our presentation, but indeed.
I'm so sorry, I was not aware of that.
Don't worry, because she represents what is the preventive strategy that we did regarding vaccination, but then I will start. So indeed, I would say that the largest suffering of the blockade regarding COVID has been in the number of affected people, provided that we did not have access to some of the drugs that we didn't know that were effective. I mean, now it's quite widely known that the COVID-19 has basically two largest phases, two largest phases. I mean, in the first one, what prevails is the viral replication, and in such a case, we didn't have access to some drugs like remdesivir, to some antiviral antibodies, I mean monoclonal antibodies that did have a large efficacy regarding neutralizing the viral replication, like the ones that President Trump used at that time, or some most recent drugs like molnupiravir, which is a Merck antiviral drug, or the last one is Paxlovid, which is a Pfizer drug that also reduced the viral replication. And in such a case, we have to somehow repurpose or reprofile some of the drugs that we did have in Cuba. And in such a case, I would say that we use interferon alpha, I mean recombinant interferon alpha, and a combination or interferon alpha and interferon gamma. And I would say that we are very satisfied with the outcome that we had, because after treating all the patients in Cuba, because before vaccination we decided in the scientific committee, because we had a scientific committee between the Ministry of Health and the Cuban biopharmaceutical industry that collectively took all the decisions, and we decided collectively to treat all the patients regardless the symptomatology. So even we treat the asymptomatic patients with interferon alpha or the combination or interferon alpha and gamma, and the outcome of this intervention was that always less than 1 to 2% of the patient population aggravated, I mean progressed to the severe phases of the disease. This is very important because we, at the beginning, were afraid that we will not have enough capacity in the intensive care unit. But after providing these cocktails of interferons or interferon alpha alone, we were able to reduce dramatically the percentage of patients that progress to an advanced stage of the disease. And then regarding the inflammatory phase, reprofile some of the drugs that we did have for other autoimmune diseases. So we did not have access to some anti-interleukin-6 receptor antibodies that were developed in the US, or small molecules like baricitinib, but we did have some antibodies like itolizumab or nimotuzumab that were originated by the Center of Molecular Immunology, which is the one that I represent, or Husbinsa, which is a small molecule with immunoregulatory activities that indeed were very efficacious in handling the severe and critical disease. And indeed, we are very now proud and satisfied because less than 20 to 30% of the patients died, even in this severe or critical stage of the disease, after being able to reprofile some of the drugs that we have developed before for some autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or even cancer or psoriasis that we were able to put in place. And I have to say that regardless, and in spite of not having these American drugs that were efficacious, no doubts, we can say today that we have better indicators when we compare the data from the United States and Cuba. So if we compare the recovery rate, I can say it proudly that the recovery rate in Cuba is now 98%.
Isn't that amazing?
Yes, as compared to the 62, which is the number of the patients that recovers among the active cases in the US. And regarding the case fatality rate, also the Cuban indicator is much better. Unfortunately, they are approaching 1 million deaths in the US. And if we compare, for example, the mortality rate regarding 1 million people in Cuba, it is much better. It is 4 times less as compared to the US indicator. So this is the cumulative number of deaths. But if we compare the actual date, I mean from the 7 days, from the last 7 days, we can claim that the mortality rate in Cuba per million inhabitants is 17 times less. And this is as a consequence of the massive vaccination of the Cuban population and also the boostering strategy, besides the good drugs that we have succeeded in handling by reprofiling these drugs that we have developed for other indications.
Well, thank you so much, Doctor. We also have, as Cristina said, another Cuban scientist who is here with us. This is Dr. Dagmar Garcia. Tell us a little bit about the Soberana vaccine, the anti-COVID-19 vaccine that you helped develop.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me. Here I'm, of course, it's a big honor for me representing here the Cuban scientific. I will try to explain some examples how much the blockade could affect our progress in research. For example, when you have a new idea as a scientific, in any place of the world, a scientific signs a paper, an order, and then he ordered for a new reagents or something new that he needs for the new idea. In Cuba, when the Cuban scientific have a new idea, that could be the idea of the COVID vaccines, and we need some new reagents for the experimentation, of course, we sign an order, but it takes never less than 3 or 6 months for acquire these reagents. That means that we have a delay for having the results because we cannot buy in the United States these reagents. For example, if we buy in Germany or in Belgium flights, the supplier could be sanctioned if they sell in Cuba.